Songweaver Media presents Mindsong, written and narrated by Michelle M. Bruin. Alísa. Alísa breathed slowly and deeply, keeping her eyes on the baskets in her arms. Her mahogany curls bounced loosely over the white linen covering the freshly baked contents, boasting a lightness she herself didn't feel. It was hard to feel festive when everyone else's excitement threatened to crush you. The last few hours had been spent cooped up in a room with 8 other people, allowing her time to slowly acclimate to their presence as she helped prepare a meal for 60. At 13 years, she was the youngest in the room by far, and so had been able to stay out of the conversation. A welcome opportunity to focus on controlling her developing psychic powers rather than her vocal stammer. Her mother, Hannah, walked before her with 3 more of the bread baskets, the dark wicker nearly blending into her flowing dress. She led the way out of the kitchens, her luscious brown hair rippling behind her as she strode confidently toward the door leading outside to the ceremony circle. Sweat covered Alísa's palms, and she braced herself as her mother opened the door and walked into the crowd of merrymakers, made up of her father's clan of wayfaring dragon slayers, and those slayers bound to this single village. The elation of the small prep team had been enough to make Alísa lightheaded if she stopped psychically pushing back against it. What would a crowd of 60-some excited people do to her? The first gust crashed into her like winds whipping through the valleys, the feeling of others' great happiness. Her father had assured her that positive feelings such as this would one day be accepted by her mind with ease. Until she learned to rein in her powers and became acclimated to the heightened senses, though, all they did was jumble up in her brain and make her head feel like it might float off her shoulders at any moment. She gripped the baskets tighter, feeling the wooden ridges with her fingers. Focus was what she needed, like her father was teaching her. "Breathe," he would say. "Feel your connection to the ground through your boots. The psychic realm is real, but the physical is where you belong right now." Alísa fixed her eyes on her mother. Despite being a normal with no psychic powers of her own, Hannah held herself high as she walked amongst the slayers, as the lady of the clan should. Alísa straightened as much as she could. The chief's daughter, too, should appear strong, even when she wasn't. She forced low, deep breaths of air into her lungs as she marched. She could do this. Every girl born to the slayers went through empathy acclimation and came out stronger on the other side. It was only a matter of time before her mind and body felt united again. She wove through the throng of slayers and their families, bombarded by chatting and laughter, the stench of sweat overwhelming the warm, pleasant smells of the bread. Alísa forced herself not to look anywhere but the baskets and her mother, staying directly behind her. They were almost to the tables. Then it was back to the kitchens for a little mental reprieve before heading out with more. A hand grabbed a corner of the breadcloth and lifted as she walked by. "So good of you to bring me my dinner, little Lisa." She twisted the basket away and attempted to give her uncle a scolding look, but she couldn't keep the corners of her mouth from pressing upward. "Wait your turn, uncle." His deep brown eyes laughed along with him, crinkling his tanned features. But with the sound came another, a laugh more of scorn than of mirth, followed by a loud whisper. "She can't even say 3 words before stammering." Her uncle heard it too, and he turned to scold the teenage girl and her laughing friends, even as Alísa turned away and hurried after her mother. At least this ceremony marked the end of their stay in this village. With the enemy defeated, her father would soon give the word to pack up the tents and move on to the next village in need of help. The teens of her father's clan might think the same way as those of the village, but they knew better than to mock the chief's daughter. The crowd's emotions hit her full force once more, and she nearly let go of the baskets to place a hand on her temple. Her uncle had distracted her, grounding her for a few precious moments before the psychic world took hold of her once more. She gave a small smile. Those moments Uncle Lennon had given her proved she was indeed growing stronger. A month ago, when everything started, nothing could stop the sensations but solitude. She set a basket on the first of the stone tables at the ceremony circle and moved on to the second. She looked back wistfully toward the hold and the kitchen within, but as her eyes slid over the crowd, they met those of the mocking girl. She quickly averted her eyes and placed the second basket down. Maybe she could take a wider path and miss the mocker altogether. "Alísa!" Her heart leapt at the voice of her father, Karn, and she lifted her eyes to find him. Bright red hair made him easy to spot. A few tables down, closer to the village chief's table and the place of honor she and her family would soon occupy. She smiled. It had been over a week since he and his men had marched on the mountain to slay the beasts terrorizing this village. He'd arrived back at the village in the late morning, at which point she'd gotten a hug and a kiss, and then had been set to work on preparations for the ceremony. No rest for warriors and their families, even on festive days such as this. He motioned for her to come to him, the red dragon scale armor around his torso and forearms glinting in the evening sun. She looked to her mother. "Papa is asking for me." Hannah looked to Karn, then back to Alísa. "Go on, then." She launched toward her father, probably with less dignity than the daughter of a chief should have. She flung her arms around his waist, his own strong arms enfolding her. He placed a kiss on top of her head. "Have I told you yet how much I missed you?" His gruff voice was music to her ears, singing of love and safety. She smiled up at him. "I missed you t. Her throat constricted around the word. "Say it! Spit it out! Too." She swallowed and looked down. No matter how hard she tried fight or ignore it, the stammer wouldn't leave her be. It was always behind her, grabbing at whatever words she had, fighting to hold them down. She couldn't even speak to her own father without tripping up. Karn placed a hand on her cheek. "Lift your eyes, Alísa. Confidence covers weakness." She forced her body to obey, pressing her lips together as she met his eyes once more. He bent closer and spoke softly. "You have to work harder than everyone else. It makes you choose your words more carefully, and that makes those which you do speak more important. Every word you speak is important. Own them." She closed her eyes and nodded softly. He'd told her as much many times before, but owning them didn't stop the stammer. He lifted his hand from her cheek. "How is your empathy?" She shook her head. "What do you feel?" "Others' happiness," she whispered. Whispering nearly eliminated her stammer, and her father was close enough that it might work even near the crowd. He nodded. "Can you tell me more?" She shut her eyes. She didn't want to try. She was supposed to be distracting herself with the physical world, not focusing on the psychic. "What kind of happiness do you feel?" he prodded. She swallowed and kept her eyes shut. If she focused hard enough, she could feel the differences between the emotions as they crashed against each other. There was the one that zipped back and forth through and across the others. Excitement. Good. And another reached out, as if seeking out the others. Friendship? Close. His voice held a smile. Camaraderie is a better term. She nodded. That made sense after what the men had just been through together. Wayfarers weren't always trusted at the beginning of their time in a new village, but by the end, at least the village-bound slayers called them friends, if not the village as a whole. Any others? She nodded. There was one emotion that first settled in her heart, then lifted upward, as if taking her to the sky on the dancing wings of sparrows. Joy. Good. I want you to focus on that last one. Push back against the others, but cling to joy. Focus on it in the same way I once told you to focus on your breathing, or an item held in your hand. She shut her eyes tighter as she concentrated. Now that she had sorted it out, each emotion was distinct and obvious. But there was so much of them. Too much of them. She pushed against excitement, and it pounded back against her from another direction. She pressed against camaraderie, but it pulled her outward with it. Her father's hands pushed lightly on her tight shoulders. Relax. She dropped them and shook her head. I can't do it. Keep trying. He stepped backward, pulling her with him. She kept her eyes shut as she followed his leading. All three emotions weakened slowly as the sounds of the crowd dimmed behind them. Excitement turned from pounding to poking. Camaraderie faded into the distance, and Joy's wings became a mere tickle against her heart. She focused on the lightness of Joy's flight, grasping at its feathers and willing herself to rise with it while excitement bounced off of her and away. A smile rose to her lips. She was doing it, feeling someone else's emotions and choosing which to leave behind and which to make her own. The darkness behind her eyelids shifted, and for a moment she wondered if she had opened her eyes to look up into the cloudless sky. Do you see it? He asked. What color is joy to you? Blue, she whispered. Light and vast, like the sky. His hand moved from her shoulder to under her chin, and she opened her eyes to see his smiling brown ones. Well done. She smiled back. I'll figure this out yet. Now, I want you to try and hold that feeling through the ceremony. Push away the other emotions, including your own, and focus on joy. She swallowed and nodded once. Joy was nearly the opposite of what she usually felt for a large portion of the ceremony, and her father knew that. What kind of slayer was she, feeling sorrow at the slaying of dragons? What they did was necessary for the protection of humankind. She knew that. It had been drilled into her since her first ceremony. But even so, she could never fully turn aside the sadness she felt at the death of hatchlings. Karn took her hand and led her to their table. All of the tables were now filled with the hearty stews, fresh bread, and soft cheeses from the kitchens. Many had already taken their seats, though a few still milled about. A group of 3 young men stood close to their table, laughing and talking jovially. Their excitement hit her like a battering ram, and she closed her eyes to push back against it. Camaraderie was there too, but any joy they might be feeling was drowned out by the other emotions. Her father's 16-year-old apprentice, Kellar, met her eyes as she opened them, and she returned a polite smile before looking away. Kellar had joined her father's wayfarers nearly a year before, but his presence was still a toppled cart of emotions. The only reason a chief ever took on an apprentice was if they had no one to lead after them. After 13 years of trying, it became apparent that her mother wasn't going to have any more children, and that left Alísa. It wasn't unheard of for a woman to lead a clan of slayers, so long as she had a strong husband to lead on the battlefield, where telepathy was needed. But a stammerer? None knew if she would be able to command their attention, so the apprentice was a precaution. Echoes of her father's words sounded in her mind. Lift your eyes. Every word you speak is important. Despite the precaution, Karn hadn't given up on her yet. She would do all she could to become what he needed her to be. Strong, confident, unbending. Alísa sat tall next to her father, surveying the ceremony circle as he did, and drinking deeply of the smells of the pork and vegetable stew. As excitement and camaraderie knocked at the doors to her mind once more, she gently ran her fingers over the stone bench, smoothed by years of use. Reality. Physical, touchable reality. She could find and cling to joy in this, in the Maker's provision for her people, in her father being safe at home and beside her, at the community between her father's slayers and the villages. Kellar slipped onto the bench beside her, his friends moving on to sit with their families. His raven-black hair was still tied back against his scalp in a warrior's tight braids, keeping the curtain to his piercing blue eyes open. She looked away. Empathy still rough, Lisa? Alísa, she corrected, keeping her gaze on the surface of the table. Only family could call her that. It's been what, 5 weeks now? She nodded, looking away slightly. I don't want to talk, she thought. Take the hint. It only took me a month to master blocking techniques. Hopefully you'll catch up soon, so you won't have to keep hiding away in your tent. She didn't respond, bristling inside. Her father said it was taking her longer because her powers were strong. He was proud of that fact, yet Kellar made it sound like it was just a problem to get over. Joy. Focus on joy. The crowd stilled as the village songweaver and a lutist stepped into the circle to bless the people and their meal. Hannah slid into her place beside Karn just as the revered man raised his voice, thanking first the Eldir, the spiritual stewards of the world, then the Maker, who watched over all creation. For safe return we thank Brawny, who keeps our warriors strong. We thank Afir, who guards by day, and Ray for nighttime song. To wounded who cannot be here, may Neela give her aid, and bring them back to us once more, made whole and unafraid. Above all else, the Maker who has given each their roles. We thank him for his blessings as we bring about his goals. For he provides Eldir and men with power, strength, and might. So celebrate with feast and dance and live in joy and light. Hear, hear! The village's slayer chief called, answered by multiple voices. Alísa smiled as joy rose around her, and she dug into her food with the same merriness as her clansmen. How she preferred this lilting blessing to the haunting beauty of lamentation. It was rare that a ceremony such as this would not require a lament, but such was the case this day. A few returners were badly burned by dragonfire, and one had broken his wrist on his shield arm. Besides those, her people had returned with scratches, scrapes, and heads held high in victory. A mournful, inhuman cry echoed off the wall of the hold and into her heart, grasping it with talons of sorrow. She shook her head. Joy. Focus on joy. That cry means victory. It means we're living out the Maker's purpose for us, just as the Songweaver said. Soon, a tawny dragon hatchling, no more than 3 feet tall at the withers, was led into the ceremony circle between two boys about her age. Its wings sagged, slashed to prevent flight once the boy's training began, and its talons scraped against the ground as it slumped along in the dirt. Horns and spines only barely protruded from its head and back, betraying its young age. A rope lay about its neck, but it was merely a precaution. What truly kept it from fighting its fate was the boys' telepathy, bolstered by that of their trainer. Though a dragon's telepathy usually surpassed a slayer's, multiple men, or in this case boys, could combine their efforts to subdue the creatures. A dragon this young had no chance against its captors. She focused on the food in her bowl as the boys released their mental chokehold on the creature, though she wouldn't be able to finish eating now. It was better to stare at the now unappetizing stew right in front of her than the sorrows that lay beyond. The little one whose family had just been taken from it. The father who had fought to the death to protect it. The mother who would rather die 1,000 deaths than see her hatchling go through this torture. At least in death they would be together. At least... Are you crying? Kellar's voice jolted her into the present, and with her sudden return she realized he was right. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hitting the table in a puddle beneath her chin. A lump lodged in her throat that she couldn't swallow down. "What are you doing?" she scolded herself. She had been sad for hatchlings before, but this was ridiculous. She was sobbing like she had when she was 5 and had seen her first slaying. She could barely feel the excitement of the slayers around her, so great was her own sorrow. "Alísa." She jumped at her father's stern whisper. "Hold yourself together." She sniffed and wiped her tears on her sleeves, but more tears fell. It was so sad. Never mind that it was a beast that would one day grow to kill. It had no one left in the world and was dying alone. She wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even a dragon. Yet, this was a part of the mission. The training that would one day allow these young teens to join the ranks of dragon slayers under the great Chief Karn's leadership. She would have to learn to appreciate these ceremonies, no matter how unfair they seemed. Karn. The brushes and sages of the highlands rustled about Karn's body as though stirred by the breath of the Nameless, those dark Eldir who had turned from the Maker and whose call the dragons heeded. He strengthened the grip on his spear and flexed his arms. It wouldn't be long before the beasts poured out of the skies to try and snuff their light. He glanced across the valley to Regan, the chief over the slayers of the village they currently fought for, and held a fist above his head. Regan made the same gesture. He and his men were in position. Karn looked up the mountainside to Lenon, his brother and second in command. He and his men waited near the cave entrance, a small, elite team of 8 men trained specifically in psychic stealth and cave storming. Each man gripped a large shield in one hand and an extra-long spear in the other. Both items would be cumbersome on the field, yet were vital for their position on the mountain. Karn sliced his hand through the air above his head, and Lenon charged on the cave entrance, his men following close behind. They formed a wall of shields at the mouth of the cave, ducking low as the first barrage of fire spilled over them. The spurting flames lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Karn himself had stormed caves a few times before, enough to know that those 10 seconds were the longest of a slayer's life. His brother had the better disposition for such a job. All it took was one moment of impatience or fear to destroy oneself and one's partners in that task. At the fire's end, Lenon's men gave a ferocious war cry and charged into the cave together, their shields pressed in front of them and their spears at the ready. Another bout of flames would soon come, and as they pressed forward, the beasts would leave the cave to try and get behind them. Once they were in Karn's line of vision, they would fall. Karn reached out with his psychic powers to take stock of his men. Determination and courage overpowered the twinges of fear and doubt sprinkled throughout. They'd done this many times before, and were ready once again to put their lives on the line for the sake of humanity. Kellar was at his side, as always, anger dappling his readiness. His hatred of the beasts stemmed from the loss of his mother at a young age, growing him into a man willing to do whatever it took to keep others from losing their loved ones. He desperately wanted to be up with Lenon's team, storming the caves themselves, but he was too young for that position. Still, if his current psychic prowess and determination were any indicators, he could become the best cave stormer the Wayfarers had ever seen. Finally, a flash of green scales sprung from the cave. As the first and only dragon his men could focus on, it fell quickly to the psychic battering of the slayers. Then came a blue beast, followed closely by a blood-red one. More and more dragons spilled out of the cave, some falling to psychic blows, and some making it past and racing down the mountain to face his men. Karn gave a war cry and led most of his men from the brush onto the field, leaving 5 unseen among the leaves. Those who stayed behind were strong psychics, who would continue watching the cave to catch any dragon who tried to get Lenon's men from behind. Across the field, Regan did the same, drawing the 8 attacking dragons' attentions to the field. Kellar ran at Karn's side, a large 2-handed shield in his hands. He would have preferred a sword or spear, but Karn's current undertaking required his full mental faculties. Kellar's protection would allow him to focus on the task at hand. He prodded each of the attacking dragons with his telepathy, testing their defenses to find the weakest among them. The large blue was strong, but the small one had little psychic defense. The largest of the dragons, a brown, was only a little stronger than the small blue. 2 blacks flew in near-perfect tandem, most likely siblings trained so that one attacked physically while the other defended psychically. He'd seen it before. It was the most strategy he'd ever seen from the beasts. Those 2 would be the hardest to take down. More dragons poured from the cave to the battlefield. Fires now lit the ground. Spears and arrows flew through the air. Karn sent a mental picture of the weakest psychics to Drenar, who led his men on the edge of the battlefield. They would now add the dragons with the weakest defenses to their hit list. The faster their psychics dropped the beasts, the fewer talons and fire blasts to worry about. A man screamed to Karn's left as flames consumed him, blasted by a large green dragon with horns like a ram's. The pain of his comrade rippled against his psychic barrier, and Karn clenched his teeth. Tonight there would be sorrow and lament. The dragon sped for Karn and Kellar, confidently low to the ground, fire brewing in its throat. Kellar flung himself between Karn and the dragon and raised his shield. Karn ducked behind just as the flames splashed against it, covering them both in near unbearable heat and setting the grass ablaze around them. The tail would come next. Ignoring the proximity of the flames, he and Kellar flattened themselves against the ground, the deadly appendage slicing through the air mere feet above them. Karn jumped back to his feet and ran after the beast, knowing Kellar would follow. This dragon would take no more of his men. The brute whipped around, spewing fire at man after man as it passed, but it sprayed harmlessly off their shields. Karn drew his spear back. "Kellar, give it everything you've got!" Together, they sent a bolt of psychic energy at the dragon, which instinctively leaned away from them, exposing its vulnerability. Its second-long falter was all Karn needed. He launched the spear at the dragon's underbelly, drawing a roar of outrage and pain as the beast fell to the ground. He drew his sword from its sheath and ran to it, but it was already dead. Down! Karn flattened himself against the ground at Kellar's call, the talons of one of the black dragons snatching at air just above them. The other black followed close behind its sibling. "We can take them!" Kellar shouted, running to Karn's position. "If we kill the psychic defender, the other will fall quickly." Karn scanned the skies around them. All other dragons were either on the ground battling with tooth and claw, or else in the air focusing on other men. He nodded to Kellar as he stood. "Mind choke. Keep your spear at the ready." Kellar dropped the shield to pull the weapon from its position on his back, while Karn pulled his own spear from the dead green's belly. Then together they reached out with their minds in a bolt of energy that spread over their target like a splash of oil. The black dragon's psychic energy squirmed and pricked against them, now nearly succumbing, now nearly slipping away. It was strong. "Bind!" Kellar growled beside him, pressing harder. The dragon slipped and slid under their psychic grip, while its partner changed course, seemingly looking for the source of the attack on its sibling. Flaming amber eyes locked on them, and it speared forward, breathing a near-blue flame. If slayers could feel a dragon's emotion, they might be driven mad with this one's rage. With a roar of his own, Kellar grabbed the massive mainstay of the dead dragon's wing and yanked it over the two of them, blocking the fire with the scale-covered topside of the creature's wing. The flames splashed harmlessly off their makeshift shield, but with the loss of sightline to their target, their telepathic hold was broken. "Karn!" A voice he didn't recognize called. "Choke it again!" He pushed up against the wing with Kellar's help, and they focused once more on the lagging defense dragon. The man who had called to him, one of Regan's, had a partner with him, and a quick check of the astral plane revealed their attempt to choke the attacker out of the skies. With 4 slayers, this would work. The defending dragon trumpeted in alarm as their attack spread over it. With a final push forward, Kellar and Karn's hold over the dragon's mind became complete, robbing it of the ability to control its body. The dragon plunged from the sky, landing with an earth-shaking thud, followed soon after by its brother. Kellar ran forward and plunged his spear into the dragon's heart and twisted, extinguishing its life. A sweeping glance at the sky revealed the last dragon falling to the ground. He looked up to the cave and saw Lennon and a couple of his men standing at the mouth. Lennon raised a fist over his head. All threats inside were gone. They had won the day. Karn wiped the blood from his spear and looked across the battlefield. Some men limped. One rolled across the ground to extinguish flames on his back, while 2 others rushed to help. One lay charred in death's clutches. He couldn't see the whole battlefield. There could be more losses. "Kellar," he called, "check in with Regan. Find out how many of his were lost or injured." With a nod, his apprentice ran off, appearing just as fresh as before the battle. He would be a great slayer one day, and a fine protector for Alísa. "Alísa, Hannah, praise you, Maker, for another day to return home to them. May our work here defend them from your enemies, never to be touched by their evil." Alísa. Alísa raised her head as the moment of silence honoring their dead came to a close. Sorrows in her heart, but dignity on her face. The last few weeks had done wonders for controlling her empathy. Grief trickled around her, but she was an island. Or, at least, the wet rocks along the shore of the island. Chief Regan raised his soft voice. "Much has been sacrificed in this battle, both flesh and life. Yet tonight we celebrate the victory won over our enemy and the life our brother's sacrifice brings. So eat, refresh your souls, and live." Alísa blew out her breath slowly, releasing the tension of her own sorrow and her work to keep others' sorrows out. The village chief spoke well. While mourning the dead was right, it was not right to focus solely on the loss. Those who had given their lives did so to bring life to their people. If any were to deny tonight's celebration in favor of grief, it would dishonor their sacrifice. Even the families of those lost were here, quieter than most, but partaking nonetheless. The only ones missing from their midst were 2 men who had been very seriously burned and needed attention from the village healer. "So, Lisa, Alísa, how did you pass your time while the men were gone?" "In blissful silence." She thought better than to say it out loud. She hated small talk, but her father's apprentice deserved a little more respect. "I did odd jobs in the village for some coin," she whispered. "What?" She sighed and repeated herself more loudly. "I did odd jobs for some coin. I needed a new journal." He nodded. "I've heard rumors that you write music. With how many journals you use and how much time you spend with Farron, I'm guessing they're true?" She gave the tiniest of nods. Farron was the Wayfarer's song-weaver, a kindly man only a few years older than her father. He was the only one she had shown her songs to, the only one she would ever sing for. He had always encouraged her to step out and show what he called her talent to the clan, but her voice was a tender subject. Even though she never stammered when she sang, her music was intensely personal. "My mother wrote music too. You should show me sometime." She didn't answer. Soon, the main event was half dragged into the center of the ceremony circle. A blue adolescent dragon, nearly 4 feet at the withers. 4 boys surrounded it, 2 from the village and 2 from Karn's Wayfarers. As soon as the mind choke ended, the adolescent shook its head hard, then flared its torn wings, roaring with fury. Alísa's eyes darted between dragon, boys, and the ever-watchful trainer. She clenched her fists around the edge of the bench. It was an unfair fight if she'd ever seen one. The dragon struck like a serpent, lightning quick, then pulled back out of range of the swords before striking again. The boys fanned out around it, swords and spears pricking whenever the adolescent struck in a different direction. It hissed and growled, but couldn't get a hit in. Alísa cringed at a slash across its flank. The more blood drawn, the wilder and more desperate the dragon's attacks became, opening itself up to more blows. A vicious cycle, raising Alísa's heart rate as it continued. Kalar's excitement rose, but it bounced off of her without any effect except to fuel her indignation. How could any get enjoyment out of this? She should have looked away from the torturous battle, but the heat welling inside of her practically forced her to watch in anger and disgust. The adolescent's roars turned to moans. It was near death. They were just prolonging its suffering now. Even a creature born in evil like a dragon didn't deserve this. How dare they? "Father, stop this!" She heard the words before she even knew her lips were moving, her own voice jarring her from indignation to horror. She covered her mouth as eyes flashed to her, the heat in her chest now rising to her face. One of the trainees cried out as a talon slashed across his sword arm in the distraction. She trembled as gasps rose from the onlookers, puffs of surprise and outrage choking her from all sides. "What have I done?" "Karn, control your daughter," Chief Regan whispered harshly. She was already moving, pulling her legs over the bench and running. What had come over her? What had possessed her to do such a thing? Thinking the training was unfair to the young dragon was one thing, but to actually speak out about it? And for that action to cause harm to one of the boys? She lurched behind the nearby hold and pressed her hands and face to the cool stone surface, breathing slowly as the dragon gave a final death cry. The anger inside her dulled, then dissipated with the physical barrier between her and the circle. So the anger wasn't mine, at least not fully. But then, whose anger did I just manifest? I suppose any of the people out there might be angry, since we lost 2 men to the dragons this time. Or maybe the boys as they fought the beast? Alísa! She flinched at her father's voice as he came around the corner. What was that? You completely lost control and caused injury to Saren's son. She flushed hot again. The hurt boy was the village second's son. A lump formed in her throat, and she fought desperately against it. I'm so sorry, Papa. I don't know. She swallowed. What happened? I was just so angry. I think it was my empathy, but it was so sudden. All at once, I wanted it to stop. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away, sniffling all the while. Will he be okay? Karn sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly, a twinge of regret seasoning his anger. Yes, the boy will be fine. To be honest, he'll probably take great pleasure in the scar. He might even gain himself a lady friend. He wiped one of her tears away with his thumb and turned serious once more. But you mustn't let it happen again. Always be on your guard. Empathy works both ways, and if you don't learn to fully control it now, you could hurt others with your own unbridled emotions in the future. She nodded. I understand. Good. He put an arm around her shoulders and steered her back toward the celebration. She swallowed. Everyone would stare at her now. Can't I go back to the tent? No. And later you'll apologize to the boy and his parents. She sighed, her heart sinking into her stomach, and marched on. A bird fluttered above them, drawing her eyes to the sky. Joy. Focus on joy. Karn. A small amount of pride rose in Karn at Alísa's sincere apology to Saren and his son. She didn't want to be here. He was forcing the issue as a matter of honor. Yet, she stood and spoke with the utmost respect and humility without shedding another tear. The boy didn't speak, instead nodding his acceptance with an air of superiority. Even then, Alísa didn't react. She'd taken that kind of response all her life due to her stammer, and it had made her stronger against it. Still, Karn felt the shame and hurt it caused her, and the very moment he gave her permission to go, she was gone. Saren sent the boy away, leaving Karn alone with him and Regan in the fading evening light. Alísa didn't know there was more to this incident than she would see. She had no idea the questions her outburst raised. Now, if he could only keep the questions and conversation to a minimum, at least until he himself figured out what had caused it. Alísa had seemed a fine girl until this outburst, Regan began. I'm assuming this reaction to the slaying is abnormal. Karn nodded once. She's a very strong empath. It's taking her longer to control her powers than for most. I highly doubt that has anything to do with it. Saren looked more to Regan than Karn. There was no anger in the circle for her to latch onto. Yet, grief and sorrows were very real tonight, Karn pointed out. It could easily turn to anger in the presence of one of the beasts responsible. But why would that make her want to stop the dragon killing? Regan crossed his arms. It should have done the opposite. Karn was silent. In truth, it wasn't far-fetched that Alísa's anger would make her want to stop the killing. Or torture, as she would call it. She'd always hated watching the training, but to let these men know such a thing would only bring her more shame. This was enough for one day. "In any case, you'll want to keep an eye on her," Regan said. "Empathy has done strange things to some women before, and you don't want to find out too late that your daughter has a—" "What?" Karn growled a challenge. No one, not even another chief, was allowed to accuse his daughter of such a thing. No one. "Of course," Regan conceded. "It's foolish to try and make sense of a girl going through the confusion of empathy acclimation on top of puberty. My apologies." Regan was a wise man, but that didn't change what he'd almost said aloud. Karn didn't acknowledge his apology, instead turning his boots toward camp. "We will take our leave in the morning. May the Maker shelter you until we come again." Regan echoed some similar blessing, but Karn didn't hear it as he walked away. His anger and worry pounded too loudly in his ears. Of course Alísa was okay. She just wasn't acclimating well. She would grow into her powers and be fine. She had to be. Alísa. The wind batted and pulled at Alísa's ponytail. Here, on the road between villages, there were no buildings, trees, or even shrubs to act as barriers from the chilling evening gusts. Just the tall grasses, her clan, and the warm browns of their leather tent dappling the valley. She imagined her empathy was like those tents, battered by the winds of others' emotions while her own were tucked away within. The walls weren't steady, and the occasional hard blast would press through the bottom of the barrier and make a mess of the inside. But such blasts made their way in less and less frequently as the days went by. This ceremony was smaller than the last two, with only her own clan in attendance. On their journey toward the next village, they had spotted a cave in the nearby rocky crags, which, upon investigation, had yielded 2 dragons and their 2 very young hatchlings. Foolish dragons, to have taken refuge in such an easily accessible cave without a clan to protect them. Her heart sank at the thought of the baby dragons about to lose their lives. Why couldn't they have killed them in the raid and been done with it? The boys had gotten plenty of training in the last village. They didn't need this. The clan sat in a half-circle, each member either on the ground or on one of the few rocks to be found in the valley. Alísa sat at the back with her parents, a precaution in case her empathy made her lose control once more. Without the resources of a village hold to provide for them, the meal was small. A slab of beef, some vegetables, and a single mug of ale for those who desired it. Her father was strict with his men when they were on the move, only allowing them a small amount of alcohol. One never knew when dragons might attack. Alísa went on guard as soon as the meal began, testing every emotion that came her way. Contentment, excitement, hunger. No anger or sorrow or other such negative emotions to be found, and nothing spiked when the hatchlings were dragged into view. Maybe she was stronger against the emotions now. Or maybe there was something about the last 2 ceremonies that had been different, and so had affected her differently. There were less people this time, for one thing. No one had been injured or killed, for another. She looked down at her food as the training began, tuning out the instructions her uncle gave to the boys. Her heart clenched within her. Just hurry up and be done with it. Her hands started sweating. She moved to wipe them on her skirt, and soon found herself trembling and gripping the fabric. Her breaths became shallow and quick. The trembling traveled up from her hands to her neck and head, caving in her throat, and making it even harder to breathe. She opened her mouth and sucked in the breaths, trying to force the air into her lungs. "Alísa?" Her father's voice seemed so far away, even though he sat right beside her. She couldn't do this to him again. She had to be strong. "I'm okay." She tried to speak loudly enough for him to hear, but she barely heard herself. "I'm fine." Still less sound escaped her tightening throat. The air was suffocating her, the noises pounding against her skull, the smells assaulting her. Everything was so near it choked her, caving in her insides and closing in around her mind. She had to get away. She stumbled as she ran for the tents, tripping over nothing, but pressing forward with each step. "What's happening to me?" She dropped to her knees and crawled behind the nearest tent, hoping against hope that it would protect her from whatever was behind her. Now that she was there, she couldn't remember what chased her. Another noise pierced her brain with the answer. Death. Death was behind her, and she couldn't escape it. It had taken her family, and she was next. She wrapped her arms around her knees, sweat sticking her clothing to her like bindings, and rocked, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. Maybe it would block out the sounds of her own demise. Soon it came. Death wrapped its cold arms around her in a tight embrace. She tried to scream, but no sound would come, her voice betraying her one last time. "Alísa!" It knew her name. "Make her help me! Help me, please!" "Alísa! I'm going to die." Karn. "Alísa!" Fear seized Karn's heart as he held his daughter close. "Karn, what's happening to her?" Hannah's wide eyes searched his as she knelt beside them. He didn't have an answer. "I'm going to die." Behind the tent, one of the hatchlings screamed a death cry. Alísa opened her mouth and tensed against him, as if to scream in tandem with the dragon, but no sound escaped her throat. Blood rushed from Karn's face as Ragan's near accusation came back to him. Was she feeling the hatchling's emotions? No. Not his sweet, good, kind Alísa. Evil couldn't touch her like that. It had to be something else. "Sweetheart, you're safe," he whispered, rocking her gently. "Remember what I've taught you. Block out the emotions. Focus on my voice." "Papa?" Her voice was so small, as if she were a little girl afraid of the dark. "What's happening? I'm so scared." He wanted desperately to cover her in a mind choke, to create a shield around her, but that went against everything he'd been taught about training new psychics. They were like caterpillars in their cocoon. Help them out of their situation, and they wouldn't grow strong enough to take care of themselves. She had to learn how to fight for herself, no matter what was affecting her. He pulled her closer. "It's okay, Alísa. I've got you." "I'm here too, sweetheart." Hannah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe." A second death cry came from the circle, and Alísa shuddered and wept against his chest. A lump settled in his throat. Dragon emotions were the only thing that made sense. "Holy Maker," he prayed silently. "Why her? Why my precious daughter? How can I help her? Help me help her." "What do we do?" Hannah searched his eyes. She was a normal, unable to fully grasp their world of telepathy and empathy. He'd have to carry both of them through this. "Alísa, look at me." She moved as though it took all the strength she had, but slowly she met his eyes. Her own were red and puffy and still full of tears. "Let it go, sweetheart. The emotions you were feeling weren't you." Her voice was barely audible. "Then whose were they? They've just died. Shouldn't you be there? With their families?" He couldn't help but be proud of her. "Always thinking of others," he thought, "even after such trauma as you've just gone through. What a chief you would make." But what had just happened was even more evidence that it couldn't be. If the others found out she was susceptible to the emotions of such evil creatures, they would ridicule her, even desire to send her away or harm her. If it was at all possible, he had to keep it secret from them. But not from her. As much as he wanted to keep the painful knowledge from her, she would never learn to fight it without knowing where the feelings were coming from. "No, it isn't one of the clan. Sweetheart," he breathed, steeling himself for the words. "I think you were feeling the dragons. I think you've been feeling the dragons at the ceremonies for the past few months now." Her eyes widened, searching his for answers he didn't have. Will it get better? The other empaths don't seem bothered by it." He swallowed. This was the part that would crush her. "The other empaths don't feel it, precious one." Alísa. Her father's words were a dagger in her heart. She was different. Again. He might try to spin it like he had her stammer, using words like unique or special, but she knew better. Different meant outcast. Different meant ridicule. Different meant alone. Again. She opened her mouth to ask what she could do, but her throat closed, allowing only a pitiful squeak to escape. "Weakling," she thought. "You can't speak, and you can't keep evil out of your head. Stupid, stupid girl." She leaned against her father and cried, gripping his rough woolen tunic. His embrace tightened, and he stroked her hair gently. Her parents' love wafted over her, soothing the wounds the dragons had left. She didn't know how long they stayed there, but when her tears finally subsided, there were a few people walking past them to their respective tents. Each one who passed glanced at them and looked away quickly. Do you think they know?" she whispered. "No," Karn whispered back. "This isn't unheard of, but it's rare. I didn't put it together until I saw your reaction to their deaths, and no one saw that but us." "Will you tell them?" "No. No one else needs to know." She looked at her mother, whose confusion and care came in alternating ripples. They joined with her father's worry and determination like the intersection of two streams, growing into a river inside of her. But this river was traversable, not like the flood of the dragon's emotions. The fact that she felt dragon emotions more strongly than human ones made her heart and stomach clench. How can I live like this? Considering the river of emotions flowing into her, her parents were probably asking the same question. They would never say it out loud, maybe not even consciously think it. But this was going to make life harder for them, especially for her father. No, she wouldn't let that be true. She wouldn't let this take his men's respect, or interfere with his way of life. Slayers had to slay dragons and protect the people. He couldn't just stop because it hurt her. She had to be strong for his sake. She swallowed and breathed deeply, allowing her throat to loosen. There have been others like me?
Yes.
Did they beat it?
Some have. Now that I know what's happening, I can help you do it.
She nodded firmly, fighting back a tremble. Then I will beat it too. Pride and joy now flowed from Karn and Hannah, and Alísa closed her eyes to see the deep sky blue. One day, she would recognize Pride's color too, but for now, all she needed was joy, to cling to it and make it her own. Lift your eyes. Author's note. Thank you so much for listening to this audio version of Mindsong. Alísa's story continues in Songflight. If you've gotten this far, hopefully that means you've enjoyed yourself. Please consider leaving a review on Audible, Amazon, Goodreads, iTunes, or anywhere else you get your books. Clear and honest reviews are the lifeblood of authors, especially independent ones such as myself. Thank you. This has been Mindsong, written and narrated by Michelle M. Bruin.